This episode of the Student Housing Insight Podcast is sponsored by Simple Bills. Utility management is a beast in student housing. If you are not offering a frictionless and transparent utility billing process for your student residents, it's going to affect the brand of your student property through Google rankings and all the other review sites. Simple Bills is the answer. Check them out at simplebills.com. Welcome to the Student Housing Insight Podcast, where we are putting you in touch with the people who bring student housing to life. I'm your host, Wesley Dees, and if you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining in. And if you work in the student housing industry, I strongly suggest these two things. One, subscribe to this podcast on whatever service you get your podcast from. And two, join the Student Housing Insight community by going to our website at studenthousinginsight.com and click on the login button up at the top right-hand corner. Once you register, you'll have access to not only post about the podcast, but we also have a job board and a ton of resources. But most importantly, you are joining a community of student housing professionals who are discussing ways to make student housing better, which is our mission here. You know, a lot of people say their pets make their lives better. I've certainly had my share of pets, and I have to say they've enriched my life and my family's life. They've served as companions. They've forced me to be active and social. I honestly may not be married today if it wasn't for a dog I had in college, and that's the story for another time. And now my family is considering entering the world of owning a service animal. Let me explain for a second. 6 years ago, my oldest daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which means she can't control her blood sugar. Sometimes it can get really high and she has to inject herself with insulin. But the most dangerous thing is that her blood sugar can drop quickly, and that can become fatal. And that's scary. I can't tell you the number of times I've woke up in the middle of the night and decided to check on her, and her blood sugar had dropped to a level that could put her in a coma. And I'm searching for candy and juice to feed her so that we can get that blood sugar up. We were able to put her on a device a few years ago that monitors her blood sugar and will send an alert to our phones if she's too high or too low, but we've had issues with those as well. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, because dogs can actually be trained to sense these drops in blood sugar. So we are now evaluating if we want to purchase a service dog for her. They're called Diabetic Alert Dogs, or DADs. They're about $20,000, and this is something that insurance doesn't cover. So if you'd like to make a donation, no, please don't send me your money. But I explain all of this because if you looked at my daughter, you would have no idea she suffers from this, yet she would not be able to live without checking her blood sugar every few hours. As we are considering this purchase, we've realized this dog will likely go with her to college in a few years. So we've been wondering, is her school going to allow her to have the dog in the dorms? Is an off-campus landlord going to allow her to have the animal? Obviously, the answer is yes, because we have laws in this country that require universities and landlords to accept service animals. But then the property manager side of my brain starts thinking about that university and the landlord and the additional responsibility that it puts on them to verify the validity of my daughter's request and how that information is going to be handled. And then there's the other issues like a roommate situation, and what happens if the roommate has a pet and they're not responsible in cleaning up the waste, and my daughter ends up being fined because a property manager made an assumption that it was her service animal. What if pets are not allowed, and because a neighbor sees my daughter with a service animal, they decide they'll just get a doctor to prescribe them a service animal to support their emotional stability or whatever diagnosis that they want to come up with? These thoughts drive me crazy, and this is the reason I've titled this episode, College Students and Pets, It's a Real Animal House. I know this topic drives property managers and student housing administrators crazy as well. So I wanted to bring in the top experts in this topic to help educate us on what the law actually states, and what are the best practices for managing a pet-friendly property, as well as the important process of just verifying assistance animals. One of the experts is a return guest to the podcast. John Bradford from PetScreening.com also owns a property management company, and he's a previous lawmaker in the North Carolina House of Representatives. So between his frustrations with tenants who didn't take care of their pets and repeatedly hearing about landlord-tenant cases that involved animals, he decided to create a company that would help the industry navigate these issues. Not only has he developed a platform and a service to address these issues, he's also meeting with HUD and other government agencies on a regular basis to point out many of the flaws in their own language and how they enforce things. So this is the guy when it comes to this issue. Our other guest is Jay Retinger with BioPet Laboratories. They provide a DNA testing service called Poo Prints. Maybe you've heard of it. This helps property managers keep their dog-owning residents accountable for their dog's waste. At one of our recent summits this fall, these guys made an announcement that they are entering into a partnership that will allow the two companies to share their information to provide a more comprehensive service to the property managers. With that being said, let's get to my interview with John and Jay. John and Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Well, this has been such of an important topic this past year, not just in student housing, but just in rental housing in general. And of course, John, you've been on the podcast before when you launched PetScreening.com, and welcome back to the podcast. It's hard to believe that was almost 2 years ago.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah. And thanks for having me. It's, I feel like a boomerang. I'm back.
Well, I'm excited, to kind of get an update of what's happened to the product and that type of thing. We'll jump into that in just a second. But let me just kind of, set this up for everybody. People love their pets, but historically, especially when it comes to student housing, full-time students have not always made the best pet owners, and therefore pets have typically not been allowed at student properties. But with, the properties looking to differentiate themselves from competitors and combine that with legal opinions regarding service animals, and most off-campus properties are moving towards a pet-friendly status because of that. And now student managers, because they're accepting those pets, are dealing with issues with breed restrictions and figuring out ways to keep harmony between tenants who are pet owners and the tenants who are not. And these are problems that need solutions. And you guys have both created services to help property managers overcome these obstacles. So that's what we're going to be getting into today. But really quick, if you guys could each, for our audience, kind of give the origin story of your companies and what they're doing. And I think that'll be a great place to start.
Very good. This is John Bradford with Pet Screening. I'll start. So I am a professional property manager. So I actually come from the industry. And so I understand firsthand the challenges with tenants who say they don't have a pet, but they might go get a pet later, or perhaps they have a visitor every weekend. Maybe it's a boyfriend or girlfriend or a parent coming up for the big game and they bring their pets. That still creates liability issues for the property manager and the landlord. And I've experienced that. I've also experienced dealing with pets, and that, pet bites are real. They do happen. And so it's important to really have as much information you can on every pet that's living in one of your assets. And then lastly, there are a lot of bad actors who are trying to circumvent pet policy. So they're trying to get out of paying pet rent, pet deposits, any type of pet fees, and they're claiming that they have a disability and a disability-related need, and they're saying their pet is really an animal. And while there are a lot of legitimate people that do have disability and disability-related needs who need these animals, there are far more group of bad actors, and I got frustrated with that. So I served in the North Carolina House of Representatives, and I was really the expert lawmaker both on the Senate and the House side. So I carried a majority of the tenant landlord bills for my state, and animal issues kept surfacing to my office. And these are really more federal guidelines, but states are still wrestling with this. So It was really from those two skill sets of being a property manager, being a state lawmaker, that I wanted to go create a service that would help the industry navigate the complexities of dealing with tenants and pets, and of course, people who say they have animals, and making sure that they're legitimate.
Yeah, and again, the company is called Pet Screening. I think you guys started out as petscreening.com, but I know in your branding you've dropped that off this past year, and we'll get a little bit more into some specific questions I've got on that. But Jay, your company is a little bit older than John's and has been servicing with the product called Poo Prints. And Poo Prints is actually part of a bigger company called BioPet Laboratories, Jay, that you're the CEO of. If you would, give us a little bit of background on BioPet and Poo Prints and how that came to be and what you guys are doing to service the industry.
Yes. Yep. Thank you, Wes. Yeah, I'm Jay Retinger with BioPet Laboratories. And BioPet is an animal genetics company. It was founded in around 2008. And Poo Prints is our flagship program and service. And some people say that we kind of stepped in this industry accidentally. BioPet, we had been providing some laboratory services for veterinary offices, doing some genetics work, always trying to see how we could solve different issues and problems through DNA technology. And we, in about 2009, we had a scientist that had moved to town, was living in an apartment complex, and there was poop everywhere. And as she got to know that property manager on site, she began to see the complaints that the property manager received, the time she had to spend dealing with it. And the story goes that one morning she stepped in a pile, our scientist, and she'd had enough. And she thought, you know what, there's got to be something that we can do about this. And so from there, we started some research about DNA in fecal matter and some canine markers, and the Poo Prints program was born. And so we've been around right at 10 years this year.
Great. So both of your companies were really kind of born out of a personal frustration that the founders and the others working in the industry were having, and wanted to find a way to fix it. John, you've got firsthand experience when it comes to property management, because your other company is overseeing single family homes, where from a pet perspective, that's kind of the ideal time when people are wanting to bring on a pet, because they are renting a house versus in a multifamily environment where you've got multiple people living on top of each other and everything else. And so that, one, I just want to say thanks for doing this, because I know that this was something that frustrated you from a standpoint of your other business. But what we've gotten from pet screening over the past year since I've been involved with it, I think is really setting, and really it's the only option out there, but it's really kind of putting everybody on notice, both on the property management side of, hey, you've got to take this pet thing seriously, because you're opening yourself up to a lot of liability, but even more so putting the residents on notice of, hey, this pet thing is serious. You need to take it seriously. Most pet owners, I believe, are responsible, but they don't necessarily understand, especially renters, they don't necessarily understand the additional implications that they could end up having by being a pet owner, especially in an apartment community. So first of all, I just want to say thanks for that. And thanks for the insight that you've given us previously on the podcast, and also part of our summits this past year. And at those summits this year, you guys actually came together to announce a partnership between your companies and how you're working and delivering both of these services to the property management industry. Can you go into a little bit about how that's going to work?
Yeah, so this is John at Pet Screening. I'll jump in and Jay can pile on. So basically, Pet Screening, we're a free service. So we don't cost a property manager a penny, or a landlord. And so we're helping create a more accountable community for all tenants and all residents, because we screen everyone, even non-pet owning residents. Now, that doesn't cost them anything. There's no charge for that, but we're going to make sure that non-pet owning residents really understand that means they know they don't have a pet today, but they're not going to do any pet fostering, any pet sitting, any pet walking, because there are, to your point, Wes, there are implications that come along with that for the property manager that these residents just aren't thinking about. These tenants don't even think that someone's visiting dog, if it bites somebody, is going to create a liability situation for an owner. But when it comes to the actual pets and animals, specifically dogs, Jay's service with poop prints, it's also creating a more accountable community. The challenge that I think both of us have, at least from pet screening, I can speak to that, is when people hear pet screening, we're a 3-year-old company. Jay's company's been around 10 years. We're a 3-year-old company. And very often they hear pet screening, so they assume that we must do the DNA testing. And we don't. We don't. We actually, as you know, screen pets for risk. We help validate assistance animals and reasonable accommodation requests. And we don't have anything to do with the DNA, but it often leads to additional discussions about that. And so we have learned that the DNA issue is real and that there's a strong interest for it. Jay and I have been on the trade show scene these last few years, so we keep bumping into each other, and we felt like there would be a natural fit. And one thing that I think pet screening brings to the table with Poo Prints working with us together is that we have a really well-orchestrated snapshot of all the types of pets and animals that live on a property. So we know if they're cats, we know if they're dogs, we know, what kind of dog, et cetera. And for Poo Prints, they need to be focused on just the dogs because they test dog waste. And one of the challenges that I know that they likely have are there are people that are dog owners that are just not being tested. And so we thought by integrating, it would make sure that Poo Prints has a better understanding of all the dogs that are on site, and the property manager knows that as well, and then they can cross-check to make sure that every dog that's living there does in fact have a DNA profile on record, so that way if there is a pile somewhere that gets tested, that there's a better chance of there being a match. And so we thought it was a natural fit. We don't do the DNA testing, they do. We're in the same pet tech property tech space, and it's been a fun journey so far, and I would say in the next 30 days the integration will be done, and then we'll just get down to making sure our customers know that both services exist, and hopefully they'll have some that we'll get, and we'll have some that they'll get, and then we'll have some that sign up with us together.
And when it comes to pet screening and kind of the profile that you guys do for each pet that comes onto your platform, I'm assuming that there would also be, with this partnership, if I've got a dog at my community and I'm an irresponsible pet owner and the dog takes his dump, we've got poo prints. The manager's got poo prints there. They send it off, get the lab test back. It's my dog. I get fined. Is it safe to assume that now that record that there's a violation, that's actually going to go on to the pet profile as well, so that it's carried over to another community if I move somewhere else that has pet screening?
Yes, you're exactly right. So we have an incident reporting, pet screening is the first national collaborative database where property managers can report incidents, everything from pet bites to pet property damage, unauthorized pets, nuisance barkers, off-leash offenders, and in this example, pet owners who don't pick up after their pet or animal. And so, yes, when there's a positive match, we'll be able to grab that data through the integration, through the reporting that Poo Prints provides to the property manager. And if that property manager is also using pet screening, we'll be able to grab that record, we'll stick it on that particular pet profile, and it will follow that pet and that pet owner into perpetuity, so that in the future, if that person moves from, and I know we're student housing, so if they're a student tenant and then they get a job and now they move into, let's say they're in Georgia going to college there, then they go to Dallas and have their first job, and now they rent an apartment, then that apartment provider in Dallas would know that this student has had a history of not picking up their dog waste. And so that becomes incredibly important. And that could be grounds very easily for a property manager to say, you know what, we're not interested in renting to you because we have some information that, we just don't think is going to match our policies here.
Gotcha. Before I get too far along, because I got some other questions for Jay that I want to ask on Poo Prints, and I want to come back to, because the other issue that we mentioned early on is not just irresponsible pet owners, but actually owners of service animals as well. And there's a lot of confusion on that property managers aren't fully aware of that I want to come back to you on those things. But Jay, just to step real quick back into poop rinse. From our other meetings, I understand that this is only for dogs. You don't service cats or anything else like that. Is that correct?
That is correct. I think I had told you before, have you ever tried to stick anything in a cat's mouth? Yeah. We have not. We get the question quite a bit on cats, and today we center only around dogs. That's usually what people are out walking, and being social with is dogs and using the open space with dogs. Some people, the cat population is growing. Some people walk their cats, but we don't have a cat program yet.
Gotcha.
Well, I was saying, and I do want to take a step back and kind of echo some of John's sentiments on our partnership. One of the things, and I think I heard you or John use it before, Poop Rinse has covered the back end. But one of the things that we have seen in the industry as we've evolved, the industry has evolved, and the pet population has continued to skyrocket, is pet screening brought pet population management full circle. We we know dogs and we know pets, and we get a lot of questions from our on-site teams, the management companies, property managers on how to handle certain things. And poop is our wheelhouse, but pet screening kind of brings it full circle for us and allows us to provide more value to our clients.
Yeah. So let's, speaking of questions, because we did find out you guys were panelists at both our Southwest and our Southeast summits this past year. And, I got to tell you, that was one of the most intense, involved sessions at both of these than I think I've had at any of the summits on any other panelists, because this is such of a real issue with property managers right now. And because of that, they obviously had a lot of questions, but some that came out of the summit, specifically for you, Jay, I wanted to bring up, because I know that the audience that's listening today's probably got a lot of those same questions. So kind of first up, can you test urine?
We get that quite a bit, and we cannot test urine. And our studies have actually shown that a majority of the time, there is not DNA found in urine unless that dog is sick, has an infection, and there's something that's causing blood or other contamination in that urine. Most urine does not contain DNA. The other scenario we kind of walk people through with urine testing is everybody watches CSI and the crime shows, and when you see blood evidence on something, which is liquid form like urine, to test that, you have to cut that, for example, you have to cut a shirt up that's got blood on it. And so until we can invent a really good carpet patching kit, we probably don't want to implement a urine program.
Gotcha. So one of the other questions, and kind of came right after the question about testing urine, is I've been on site and been the guy that has to pick up the poop, right? and when you're going through that, you understand all the reasons why you actually fine the resident back for this, because it's so irresponsible. But there are those situations where there's no picking the poop up, right? The dog is either sick or something else is going on. How well can that be tested?
It depends. We do have an extensive training that we walk our on-site teams through on how to collect poop, how much is needed, what type of weather conditions. We recommend that if you've had a loose stool, something that is all over the grass and is hard to collect, that a lot of times you're probably better off not trying to get DNA from that. What a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't realize till a while back, is the DNA is not in the poop. and the visuals for this are not that appetizing. The DNA,
I can imagine.
Yes, the DNA is actually located on the outside of that sample.
Gotcha.
As that sample passes through the intestines and everything, it's rubbing against those walls and it's collecting those cells. So when you get a loose sample like that where a dog's sick, there probably was not the friction needed to collect those cells.
And I hope for everybody that's listening to the podcast, you're not in the middle of eating lunch or
right.
anything else. It's probably more information than I ever wanted to know about collecting dog DNA. Yeah. So once we do have that healthy sample and we send it off to Poop Rinse, what's kind of the turnaround on getting something back and being alerted? Hey, this is such and such resident.
Yeah, so we tell people be prepared for 2 weeks, 2 business weeks to get results back. But we know that sometimes in the day-to-day life of everything going on a property in a community, 2 weeks can be an eternity. So our goal is that we're usually running about 5 to 9 business days for sending results back. And they're automated through our system. You get an email, you get a notification. And so, we try to stay within that 5 to 7 to 9 time period.
Gotcha. So, what does the service typically cost? And are there any localities in which is, because everywhere I've used Poop Rinse, it's something that we've passed on to the resident, but are there any localities that will not allow the landlord to pass this cost along to the tenant?
There aren't any localities that I know of off the top of my head. We have 4,000 communities across the world that use the program, and most do pass it on. We have a couple different implementation methods that we work with properties to roll out. Some people just pass it directly on when they implement the program. Sometimes there may be some pet rent or pet fee increases that allow the property to compensate for it over time. There are really 2 simple costs for the program. The first cost is registering the dog. And you know how costs can vary by market, like most things. But usually it's around $40 to $42 to get the dog registered. And what we have focused on, we know too that properties want to be competitive and provide their residents with amenities. So we have baked into the system a number of partnerships that allow the property to give that pet owner, that pet parent, some free stuff. We've got a partnership with Rover. We've got a partnership with Chewy. We've got a couple others that we're hoping to release towards the end of the year. We also include a free health and wellness application in our system to that pet parent.
Oh, cool.
And it's great. It has, think of it like a maintenance plan. What do you feed your dog? When do you give them checkups and vaccinations and that kind of stuff? Goes back to that responsible pet ownership. The second cost is for the processing of the poop. So we have a lab fee when that poop sample is sent in to us that we send to the property and invoice them for the processing of that poop. And those range from about $62 to $65. And then obviously that cost is recouped by the property in the fine that's instituted. We stay out of the fine amount. We just provide the service and we let the property dictate the course they want to take with the resident.
Right. So this next question I loved when it came from the audience. And I've made a couple of changes here just to hide the innocent. But what I loved about this is exactly what, I think a student would do if they were required to register their pet with Poop Rinse. So I'm a University of Georgia student who owns a bulldog. I'm sure that happens. I'm sure in Knoxville, where you're from, there's a lot of blue tick hound owners that are also UT students. So, and my parents own a bulldog as well. So I take my swab kit home to my parents' house and swab their bulldog. And then I don't pick up the dog's crap on my property, and it ends up getting tested and it's not my dog. What's the workaround for that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as we rolled the program out, we understood that, like John mentioned earlier, with even with pet screening, there can be bad actors in any aspect. And so at the end of the day, we are a forensic service. And so chain of custody is very important to us. So first of all, when we work with the on-site team to roll the program out, we want to create an event and have something that's fun and people are excited about implementing the service, bring people down to the office, pool, whatever. And so we recommend that all swabbing takes place in the presence of an on-site team to avoid that. So you can't go home and swab your parents' horse, or you can't go home and or go back to your apartment and swab the guy that's been sleeping on your couch for a week, to make sure. And we can also take a photo in our system. So we want to make sure that the appropriate dog gets tested. And then we constantly work with the on-site team to do pet audits and reevaluate their pet population to make sure that everybody's registered, that they have a DNA profile. That's one of the most exciting things for us with pet screening, is because you're capturing all of that pet population. And then we also have different protocols that we call DNA verification kits. So if there is ever a question about if a dog has been screened or not, or swabbed and registered, we can send a free kit to the property, have that dog swabbed, and we can test it against the profile we have in the database. And that I'm going to get in the scientific weeds for a minute. That's where I think sometimes there's a big misunderstanding about our program and DNA that I like to point out. In the research that we did to create the genetic profile that we use for our program, it's not based off breed or traits or things like that. So, if everybody owns a blue tick hound, a lot of places think, well, I got a bunch of blue tick hounds in our community. How do you distinguish between the different Smokies? Our profile is designed just like the FBI uses with a human profile to distinguish to that exact dog, like a fingerprint. So we can even tell litter mates apart from each other. Every dog has a unique genetic profile in our database.
That's amazing. I like your recommendation there that you do this you do the swab inside the office with the pet there. As pet friendly communities and student housing became a thing, we started switching over. When I say when I was on site, we started doing pet interviews, and it was made into this kind of cute thing that regardless if it was a resident that was getting a pet or if it was a prospect that was going to be moving in and they brought their pet. We kind of went through a little dog and pony show, so to speak, of showing them off on the property, getting their picture, posting them to Facebook of, hey, Smoke is going to be living at this property next year, and turned it into kind of a social event almost, and integrating that into the whole thing, I think makes a lot of sense. So it's a cool idea. Beyond the service, what other kind of stats do you guys provide to the property managers?
Well, we've got a number of stats. I mean, with our results, when a waste sample comes back and it matches, a dog that's on property, it matches in the database. We provide, it's what we call random match probability. You've probably heard it in court cases and in the human aspect of things, where we provide them a number that says, hey, there is a 1 in 5 trillion chance that this profile could match any other dog. We also work with property managers to try and understand their pet population. How many waste samples per dog on their property are they seeing? For example, our kind of baseline is at a property. If you've got 100 dogs on a property, you should not be sending in more than 10% in waste samples of that population. Now, some it may vary, a couple points here or there, but the goal is that the pet owners register their dogs. They understand the accountability and the consequences if they don't pick up, and it starts to modify behavior.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Jay, it's completely amazing what you guys are able to do. Again, thanks for what you guys are providing. And one last thing before I go back to John and we start getting into the conversation about support animals and service animals. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you and your company?
Yep, we've got representatives throughout the country, but the best way to get a hold of us is you can go to poopprints.com. There's a place there you can fill out. We have a live chat, but you can also go there and fill out a contact us form, and we will send the representative in your area to you. And there's a 1-800 number on there where you can call us anytime, and we'll address your questions, needs, anything you need.
Perfect. So, John, I think where a lot of property managers feel a little bit confused and where things with pet ownership becomes a real struggle for them is when it comes to service animals and emotional support animals. I want to get into emotional support animals for just a second. It's easy to see the necessity of a CNI dog, but an ESA, emotional support animal, who helps a resident cope with their PTSD or depression, it's hard to determine the validity. And what I love about your service is that you take that verification process off of the property management's hands. Your attorneys have vetted your process, and you've even met with HUD to discuss issues with their own guidelines. Understanding that the manager doesn't feel pressure to make an assessment, you guys do that, and it diffuses the anxiety of both the manager and the resident in that process. However, when those ESAs cross over into dangerous, aggressive breed dogs or something from a farm or an exotic animal, managers have to think about the safety of other residents. When that happens, what's the appropriate response that manager can feel confident that they are within fair housing and HUD guidelines?
So, this issue is complex. You hear a lot about the peacock on the airplane. Recently, we saw a miniature horse on the airplane. And so airplanes, the airline industry, falls under the ACAA, which is the Air Carrier Access Act. And then, of course, you have the ADA, which everyone knows is the Americans with Disability Act, and they define service animals, and those would be limited to dogs and miniature horses in areas of public accommodation being restaurants and theaters, any place where the public is generally welcome. And the rules and the guidelines under ADA as it relates to service animals is not the same as the rules as they relate to the Fair Housing Act, which is for private accommodations, which would be rentals. For individuals that do not have readily apparent disabilities. You mentioned someone who's blind. Someone who's blind who has a dog, very clearly that's a readily apparent disability. So very naturally, they need their dog to be able to navigate and have a quality of life. And there's really nothing any housing provider or any public accommodation place of business would do or can inquire about because it's obvious what it's for. But there's a large population where those are not as obvious. And under the Fair Housing Act, people often confuse the ADA, and people come in and say, this is my service animal and it's my registered service animal. And there's really just no such thing. There's no such thing as any registry. There's no federally recognized registry by ADA, by the Department of Justice, or by HUD for that matter. And so what
they have these pretty certificates that really look.
Oh yeah, they're beautiful. Yeah, they look like diplomas. I give them credit. The certificates look very sexy. They look very official, but they're not sufficient forms of documentation to support the reasonable accommodation request. Even in this podcast, you've mentioned emotional support animals and service animals. The proper terminology is assistance animals. Mm-hmm. Assistance animals is sort of the global term under the Fair Housing Act. Assistance animals can include a service animal, an emotional support animal, therapy animal, companion animal.
Gotcha.
But the overall term is assistance animals. And what we do at pet screening is we review those reasonable accommodation requests, and we make sure that those requests meet the Fair Housing Act guidelines. There are grounds of where accommodation requests can be denied. And you mentioned dangerous breeds. There is no breed limit, if you will. There's no guidelines around breeds or restrictions under the Fair Housing Act. So all breeds are fair game under the Fair Housing Act. However, if you can demonstrate that the specific animal in question has a history of being dangerous, which means you would have to have some sort of evidence to support that, then that could be, depending on the situation, that could be grounds to deny a reasonable accommodation request because this animal has a history of biting, for example. And biting, though, was it provoked or was it unprovoked? And we've had instances at pet screening where we've had people submitting an accommodation request and they said, yes, my animal has bit someone, and they provided records from the police department of the biting incident. And I can think of one where the dog was protecting its owner from someone who was attacking her. And her dog is her service animal, and it was doing what it was supposed to do. That dog was attacking the person that was the assailant who was attacking her. Therefore, that dog was provoked. And so that would not be necessarily grounds to deny someone because the dog didn't just bite someone unprovoked. It bit someone because someone was attacking its owner. And that's a very natural characteristic of a lot of dogs. And so you have to be careful and be thoughtful when you're trying to say there's a safety issue. You really need to have bona fide proof, and you need to be able to demonstrate that there's a real reason for it. So that could be grounds to deny an accommodation request, but it's not as easy as just saying, oh, that's a pit bull, they're dangerous, which I don't necessarily share that sentiment, but we hear that a lot. Oh, it's a pit bull, therefore it's dangerous, and we're not going to allow it. That is not an appropriate application of the Fair Housing Act guidelines. You'd have to prove that that specific pit bull has had a history of creating some sort of safety issue, and you'd have to have the evidence to back it up.
Gotcha. Explain really quick. I want to make sure that property managers also understand where this is kind of going when it comes to assistance animals, and why something like pet screening is so important in order to not just take this off their shoulders, so it relieves some of the things that they're doing, but even from a standpoint of additional liability. Because if they're asking for doctor's notes and those kind of things, all of a sudden they're going to have to come under HIPAA at that point as far as that documentation. Is that correct in my assumption with that?
Well, I mean, it's really not, and I'll explain why. HIPAA is really a Privacy Act related to healthcare providers, and property managers have no obligation to be HIPAA compliant. However, it is a very slippery slope when any housing provider starts to deal with someone's very confidential and personal medical records. And because the Fair Housing Act says that you can never inquire to the specific nature of anyone's disability, so really you should never be asking about someone's disability in terms of, well, what is your disability? That's a giant no-no. You can inquire if they have a disability, which is a yes or no question. The challenge is a lot of times the documentation that's being brought forth by the requester or the applicant is very thorough and very comprehensive, and it often has very sensitive medical related documentation, and that is someone's healthcare record. And even though HIPAA doesn't necessarily apply to property managers, it is debatable that there's a responsibility incumbent on the property manager, the landlord, to safeguard that document. And what pet screening does is we actually accept those documents so that the on-site managers and the landlords no longer have to take those documents. They can access the documents and they can authenticate who in their organization should be able to even see the document. So they can decide, maybe if it's a larger organization that has legal counsel, maybe they're the only ones that can see it, or maybe it's the most senior property manager on site at that location, but all the other leasing agents cannot. We give full flexibility to our clients to decide who can and cannot see those documents, because we like to say we want to save them from themselves. It's easy to get busy and let a document sit on your desk for 3 hours while you're doing other things. But if another resident comes by at lunch and wants to drop something off and this letter's sitting on the desk and they start reading it and they go, oh gosh, I know Susie in 2B has a PTSD and depression and anxiety, that information could be tracked back to the property manager for not safeguarding it. So at Pet Screening, we take those documents and we use Amazon Web Services, which do have HIPAA compliance type ratings. And so we just feel like it's wise to use servers that are secure. And so we store those documents, and it's just a more secure situation for not only the requester who has the disability, who's submitting this information, but they can now be more confident that that is not floating around the local office, or better yet, just scanned and uploaded into Entrata or Yardi or OneSite or whatever the software application is, because other people can still have access to that software and still navigate to that record. And so that's one thing that we do, is try to help protect that, because we know it's an exposure point.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned something there in regards to property management software, and I know you guys provide a lot of integrations when it comes to the application process, for example, with Entrata, because it's very popular within student housing. There's a sequence of events that have to happen before an application is approved for residency. And one of those may be, this pet application. And because you're screening everybody and having them sign off on something, even if they don't have a pet, so that they do understand if mom and dad bring a pet, if girlfriend brings a pet,
that's right.
They've still got to register it with the office and have it screened. Because you're doing that, are you working with the integration with those platforms so that application is not approved until that's signed off of?
So we designed our product to work with any platform. So we can coexist with, Entrata, OneSite, Yardi, ResMan, Propertyware, AppFolio, you name it. We could not be presumptuous and think that all of those platforms would ever want to do business with us. The good news is they are wanting very much to do business with us. And so we have some two-way integrations with Yardi, OneSite, Rent Manager. Entrata's next on our list. But it is important to note that we have clients that use those products and they still choose not to use the integration. They have their reasons for that. So, there's no limitation from anyone, no matter what platform they're using, to get started using pet screening. And because we screen everyone, from people who have no pets to residents that have pets to residents that have animals, it's very simple process. The property manager just knows that everyone applying needs to go through our service, and we have a way to provide a very unique and customizable landing page for that particular community or that company, so that they can direct them to one site, to one location, I should say. And then once we finish our work, then we push the results back into a dashboard of which all the users of that community or that company can see the results. And then it's very easy for them to share that data into their platform. So if they use Entrata, they could share the information right into Entrata, because everything we do is digital. So everything has digital DNA. Well, no pun intended with Jay on the podcast here, but digital URL links, which is kind of like a DNA for a specific profile. You can share that into your own platform if you want. And of course, because we're going to be integrated with Poop Prints, if there's a DNA number, which is I think they call it a DN number at Poop Prints, then that would already be in our profile with all the other data. So we would already have that. So now that minimizes the number of places these property managers have to go look for things.
Gotcha. So one thing I want to make sure that the audience really understands is pet screening is not just putting checks on the boxes for things that needs to be collected. Like, you guys are really going back and verifying these things.
Yes, we are.
You've shared some stories with me at some of these summits about folks that had completely forged a letter from a doctor on letterhead with his signature. And you guys actually called to follow up. Even though you got the letter, everything seemed legit, you guys called again to say, hey, we received this letter. We want you to confirm it. And he said, that's my letterhead. That's my signature. I did not write this letter. And so I think that's just amazing that this isn't just a repository for forms that are needed, but you guys are taking the extra step of really going after this documentation and certifying that it's actually certified, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah. So under the Fair Housing Act, you have to treat every requester individually and uniquely, because in theory they have a disability, and everyone with a disability is unique. So you cannot automate this process. So yes, pet screening is a technology tool, and as it relates to animals, we collect a lot of information regarding their reasonable accommodation request. but it goes beyond just collecting it. We then actually have an in-house legal review team that reviews the information. And when I say a legal review team, we have a federal litigator that runs our legal review team. This is human capital. We are reviewing every single reasonable accommodation request. We make sure that the 2 HUD permissible questions are answered correctly. We make sure that the date on the letter is in a reasonable time frame. We make sure that the requester's name is in the documentation. If it's not, we ask for the housing related relationship between the requester and then the name in the document, because it could be a stepchild or a husband or wife that just don't have the same last name. So we make sure we understand those roles, and then we review the letter. We make sure the language in some way affirms that there is a disability and a disability related need. And if we believe the language meets those requirements, the very last step, which is really the heaviest lift, is we actually contact the third-party providers. And we're doing that either through email or by telephone verifications. And we're on hold literally all day long. Our team is calling Kaiser Permanente. We're calling United Healthcare. We're on the phone with the medical records departments. And we're making sure that these documents, that they find the same document in their system. And what we're really essentially having them do is we're having them validate the authenticity of the document. And to your point, this is where we find a lot of fraud. We have reviewed, as of today, we've reviewed over 18,000 reasonable accommodation requests.
Wow.
And that may not sound like a big number, but let me tell you something. That is a lifetime supply for any company. I mean, it really is. Even the largest companies. We've done 18,000 reviews since we started 3 years ago. And if you're curious about how many of those reviews actually met the Fair Housing Act guidelines, it's just over or 11,000 of those did not meet the guidelines. It's right around 60%, 60. Now, I don't want to suggest that 60% are fraud. What I will say, though, is that 60% of them just don't meet the guidelines. It could be it's insufficient documentation. It could be their documentation doesn't meet the guidelines and it's inadequate, meaning it doesn't have the specificity it needs. And we return these back to the requesters and tell them what we need and put the ball back in their court. And a lot of these folks will self-convert these requests and process it as a pet. And then they come through our pet process. And when they come through our pet process, that means they've self-converted it from an animal to a pet. Pets are not a protected class. That means housing providers can move ahead with their pet fees, their pet rents, pet deposits, whatever it is they charge. And then, of course, if it's a pet, we do all of our risk analysis, and then, of course, we issue our FIDO score. And FIDO score is a sort of a clever marketing term, but everyone is very familiar with other scoring systems, and we use a FIDO score. And the FIDO score, the property managers are using to set their pet fees and pet rents. And so the whole pet part of our screening is very, very important, but that's how folks start with an animal and then sometimes convert themselves to a pet. It's really an incredible service, and the only people that pay, Wes, are pet owners. It's free to animal owners because we cannot charge them. We do not charge them. It's free to residents and tenants that do not have a pet, because naturally we could never charge them, but we still make them go through the process and get them on the record. The only role in this entire equation that's paying anything are the tenants and residents that have a pet. And it's a nominal fee. It's $20 for 1 year. And we give them a service in return. A pet owner gets a really cool pet management product for a year so that they can take their pet profiles and share it with their doggy daycares and their dog groomers and dog walkers. So pet owners get a really neat product, but what the property manager gets is all that data, the photos, the vaccination records, the microchip records, behavioral history. If they're doing business with poo prints, we'll grab that data, stick it in as well. They'll get any of the incident reporting if there's been any past incidents with that resident from another property, and then they'll get the FIDO score. And the FIDO score is really for the property manager's eyes only. The pet owner has no idea they're being scored, and that FIDO score can help property managers make much better decisions about pets and their owners. Not all pet owners are equal, and our FIDO score reflects the pet owner and the responsibility level of that owner as much as it does the pet.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've got some other questions that from our audience that I want to ask, but before I do that, this is kind of a question to both of you guys. As far as any other type of legislation that property managers need to know of that may be recently on the books or something that's coming up, is there anything that you would want to share for our audience to say, hey, keep your eyes on this, or understand this law just came into effect recently? Anything there that you guys would like to share?
Well, I'll start with on the animal side of the house. No pun intended for your show here, but just know the Fair Housing Act is a federal guideline, and there's a lot of states that are passing or attempting to pass additional statutes as it relates to assistance animals. Some states might be saying, for example, that a healthcare provider must be licensed in their state to be able to properly diagnose an emotional support animal. And what I will share with you is that HUD has not reviewed any of the state laws and determined any of them to be substantially equivalent with the Fair Housing Act at the federal level. So what that really means is just be aware that wherever you live, whatever state you live, there's the state issue, but then there's the federal issue. And pet screening, we apply the federal standard. It's the highest and the most safe, in our opinion, guidelines to apply. Mm-hmm. If you follow your state laws, if you do live in any states that have passed laws that are maybe more restrictive than the Fair Housing Act, then it could put you in a quandary, because you might not have a state claim, but then you might have a discrimination claim at a federal level. And so just be aware that states have their own sovereignty and their own rights, but they cannot usurp federal authority. So just that, to me, is a real quandary for the industry. And so I just want to make sure all your listeners know that it's easy to get excited about what my state's doing as it relates to assistance animals, but it depends on what the statutes are, that not all of it may be shared with HUD. They may not share that same perspective. Where I would recommend folks focus on is the fraudulent aspect. Any state that can strengthen their criminal penalties for people who are committing assistance animal fraud, mm-hmm. that is something that I think every state should be doing, because in those instances where we find fraud, then a property manager can actually prosecute, find a DA, and not until the bad actors start paying the price will other bad actors realize this is not a good idea.
Exactly right. Jane, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I follow John the Lawman on all law decisions.
Great.
I've been called far worse.
All right. So let's get into some of the pet screening questions that came from our audience at the summits. You talked already about how you guys actually make money. This service is 100% free to the property management company, the properties. There's nothing there that they're taking on, no type of setup fee or anything like that. Am I correct?
You are correct. The only disclosure I have to make is this is assuming that they're pet friendly. If they don't allow pets, they cannot use us to validate their animals, because we would have no way to make revenue.
Gotcha.
So if they're a no pet facility or a no pet company, then we would not be a good fit. But if they're pet friendly and they do business with us, then of course we're going to generate revenue through those pets, and then we're happy to help them on the animals. We keep a very watchful eye on the ratio of how many animals we are receiving versus the number of pets, and we know what the ratio should be. So if we're starting to get a high number of animals and very few pets, then it might drive a different discussion, which could lead to just discontinuing the service, or just a friendly reminder that your property managers need to send us everyone, because without the pet revenue, we have no way to pay our legal review team to go do the hard work that they're doing on the animal side.
Yeah. How long does the screening process typically take?
So it's instantaneous for the no pet profile, because we're just basically getting a lot of policies on the record. So there's nothing slowing them down. On the pet side, when we collect all the data from the tenant and resident, for everything from photos, if they submit any vaccination records, when they submit it, our very complex and proprietary algorithm instantly reviews and analyzes the data, and then we give a FIDO score. So it's pretty darn instantaneous as well. The animal side, because there's human capital, we review it within 24 business hours, but because we're also dealing with the third-party healthcare providers and the fact that we're contacting them, we often are slowed down because that healthcare provider may not respond to us, and we give them 2 attempts, 24 hours and 24 hours. And if they don't respond, then we return it back to the animal owner. The good news is we do it faster and more efficient than anyone can do it, because we're doing it the right way. And if a company was doing it the right way, they would have to be going through these same exact steps. And number 2, we always put the ball back in the requester's court, because it's incumbent on them to deliver what is needed to support their claim. So everything we do is tracked, and there's threaded discussion between our legal review team and the requester. So any property manager can see exactly what's going on, what has gone on, what has transpired, and it's all there for their ability to use anytime.
I love this this next question that we got. I think this was in Waco, but the question was, is it valid if a resident states they have multiple ESAs?
Yeah, so what they're really saying is, can a resident have multiple assistance animals? And the answer is yes. The Fair Housing Act does not limit the number of animals. The Fair Housing Act uses words like it must be reliable, credible, meet the test of reasonableness. When it comes to multiple animals, there must be a nexus between each animal and the individual's disability and how that animal addresses or ameliorates the disability. So let's just take an example of some resident that has 3 cats. The healthcare provider is going to have to provide some sort of specific information that would demonstrate that cat number 2 and cat number 3 provide a nexus to the disability that cat number 1 does not provide. And so you can't just use a letter that says animals, plural, and then use it for 5 or use it for 10 or use it for 3. A lot of residents, a lot of property managers use these letters with multiple, it'll say plural and they'll use it for 3 and 4, but they really have more rights than that. The beauty is when you use pet screening, you don't have to really worry about that anymore because our legal review team, we check into that. We make sure that that we believe there is a nexus between those animals. And it's not uncommon, Wes and Jay, for a family. A husband might have a request for his animal. A daughter might have a request for her animal. So is that multiple animals living in one household? Yes. But we would review the husband or the father's request individually, and then we would review the daughter's request individually. That's how we would treat that.
Gotcha. Hey, and to take that back towards student housing, and there's a mother is going to visit her son, right? And he may have pet or a service animal, and then the mother is bringing, what could be an ESA. How would you direct a property manager to screen both? Because essentially, we'd want both of those animals screened. Is that what you would suggest to them, or is there another way to go about that?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that there's an issue when you have a resident who's living in a property and then they have a friend that's trying to come up and the friend wants to bring their emotional support animal. The test there is that the friend is not on the lease with them. Therefore, that friend's emotional support animal isn't exactly fair game to bring over to the residence. And so that's part of the confusion here. Now, if the friend is blind and the friend has a seeing eye dog, well, now there's an obvious disability. It would be reasonable to allow the friend with a seeing eye dog onto the property and to come over and visit the friend. So emotional support animals, assistance animals in general, are all about for the residents or the people that are living in the unit, the actual rental. People on the outside who have emotional support animals need those for their residences, but they just don't get a hall pass to bring that over and visit. And if a property, though, said, you know what, that's fair game, we welcome that, they most certainly in advance could work with pet screening. And again, as long as they're not taking advantage of our service, we would be willing to, even help validate a friend's emotional support animal for the purpose of visiting. But that really is outside the guidelines, and we would just be doing it more as a favor to help. We just wouldn't want someone taking too much advantage of that because that's more animal reviews for us, for people that aren't even living there.
Gotcha. Perfect. Last question. What type of language is needed for the lease agreement and the resident application in order for implementing pet screening?
So on the resident application, it's easy. You would just make sure that in your resident application or as a part of the application process, everyone understands that they need to go through pet screening. Now, if you're using one of our two-way integrations, so if you're current OneSite or if you're currently with Yardi, that's kind of done automatically. And we're working on Entrata probably in 2020 here, probably the first quarter. But without those integrations, you would just direct everybody to the landing page that is customizable for that community. And when they get to that landing page, that resident's going to have a choice to either say, I want to start with no pet, I want to start with a pet, or I want to seek an accommodation request for an animal. They have 3 choices to make. And whichever choice they make, it doesn't matter. We know that it's coming from that community. So in the application process, we provide communities with digital flyers that they can email their residents or their future residents. They can put it in the actual application process. So we can absolutely kind of guide and coach them on how to do that. In terms of the actual lease agreement, I would just say make sure your policies are up to date. It's probably not a bad move to just say that you use a third-party pet screening company. You don't really want to reference petscreening.com because we don't want them going to petscreening.com. We want them coming to the landing page that was directed, that we gave the community. And if you say we use petscreening.com, we don't want them coming to us directly. But to call us a third-party pet screening service is fair game because, the word pet screening would be separate. They're two words. So it's probably not a bad idea just to disclose that they use pet screening for all their residents, but I would more focus on the policies. What happens if you're caught with an unauthorized pet? What are your breed restrictions as it relates to pets, if any? And we're seeing more and more companies that use pet screening drop their breed restrictions because the FIDO score lets them make better decisions. Because I promise you, not every pit bull, not every German Shepherd is someone not worth renting to. There are some very wonderful dogs that have wonderful, loving owners that are willing to pay higher pet fees, higher pet rents just to have their dog live with them. And if our FIDO score can help you make a better decision and know the risk you're taking, then why not give those folks a chance? Because what's happening is without it, they're coming back tomorrow with a letter from their healthcare provider, and chances are you might have to let that pit bull or that German Shepherd in anyway, but now you're not going to be able to charge any revenue for it. So you might as well try to monetize everything that you can within reason and just know the data. And there's a reason that the top 5 animal breeds are pit bulls, German Shepherds. They're in that top 5 list. It's because in a lot of cases, those are restricted pet breeds and people are just coming in with healthcare provider letters.
Yeah, exactly. Well, John and Jay, I appreciate this so much. I appreciate what your companies are doing. Appreciate your support of our podcast and Student Housing Insight. But the services that you guys are providing to the industry is just remarkable. You've taken a huge frustration point for the property management industry and becoming more so now for the student housing industry as well, and making this a much more simple process and really, allowing us to do what I think we do best, which is service our residents and give them a place that they can call home when they're away from home. So, being able to include their pets in that and their assistance animals is a huge deal. And you guys are helping us manage that process, and I appreciate it greatly. Any other parting thoughts, guys?
No, we just appreciate you having us on the show today, and we're excited to be working with you and your team, and we look forward to getting our integration finished with Poo Prints, and we hope everyone out there will use our services together.
Great. And John asked Jay earlier about contact information. Obviously, petscreening.com is the website. Any additional information you want to pass on in regards to contact?
We make it easy. You can send an email to info@petscreening.com if you're interested, or of course, go to our website. Either way, we're here to help you, and we look forward to servicing anyone that comes our way.
Well, great, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Guys, thanks for listening, and I hope this episode helped you get some clarity about your plan for managing pets and assistance animals. Again, I want to thank Simple Bills for sponsoring this podcast. And don't forget, you can go follow this discussion and many more on the SHI community forum at studenthousinginsight.com. All right, guys, have a great day.